Since the start of the pandemic, Asian people across the world have been blamed for spreading the virus. This led to an increase in hate crimes and racist attitudes toward the Asian community. Many people have spoken up in defense of Asian Americans, while others have actually tried to invalidate the discrimination that these people face. However, racism towards Asian Americans did not start with COVID-19. The U.S. has a history of implementing discriminatory laws targeted at different groups of Asians and their ability to immigrate to the U.S. So let's go back in time and see what happened. When Chinese people immigrated to the U.S. in the 1850s to look for jobs, people started to see them as threats to the economy. As a result, the government implemented anti-Chinese laws to protect Americans. The first of those was the People v. Hall. The People v. Hall was a Supreme Court case in 1854 that prohibited Chinese people to testify in court under any circumstances. This case began with a murder in 1853, where George Hall and two other men were arrested and brought to trial for killing a Chinese man, Ling Xing. Initially, George Hall was convicted, while the other two men were acquitted. Soon after, George Hall appealed the decision and argued that Chinese witnesses should not be allowed to testify in court, just like African Americans and Native Americans were not allowed to at the time. California Supreme Court Chief Justice Hugh Murray agreed and wrote, "Allowing non-white people to testify against a white man would be dangerous. If they were allowed to testify, they might then be allowed to become citizens and jurors and legislators." So in the end, the testimony from the Chinese witness was thrown out and George Hall was released. Fortunately, the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1866 allowed any person of color to testify as a witness or victim. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 imposed a ban on Chinese immigration and citizenship to the U.S. for 10 years. The Gary Act of 1892 extended the ban of Chinese immigration for another 10 years and required Chinese residents to carry citizenship documents. If caught, they faced a year of harsh labor or deportation. In 1893, the Supreme Court case Fang Yuting versus the United States made Chinese immigration illegal in 1902. In 1943, the Magnuson Act was introduced, and it only allowed for 105 Chinese people to enter the U.S. per year. In 1871, the Chinese massacre took place in Los Angeles, California, when a mob of about 500 people shot, stabbed, and hung 19 Asian Americans. Some sources say this is the largest mass lynching in U.S. history. This all started when two Chinese businessmen were fighting over an abducted woman and noticed the police were onto them. They reacted by opening fire on the police, killing one of the officers. Afterward, rumors spread that Chinese people were killing white people in large numbers, which led to the large mob entering LA with violent intentions. Some people tried to help, but because of the precedence of the Supreme Court decision of People v. Hall, they could not defend the victims against the mob. 9 men from the mob were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison, but a year later, all their charges were dropped based on technicalities. There was barely any coverage about this tragedy, and it only furthered anti-Chinese sentiment. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which ultimately brought the US into World War II. After the attack, people were afraid that Japanese Americans were spying on the US as part of the Japanese government. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which placed anyone of Japanese descent into internment camps, which were basically crowded and unsanitary prisons. The Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States deemed these internment camps constitutional. When the camps closed after the war ended, the Japanese were only given $25 and train tickets to return home. However, many had already lost their homes and jobs. Racial discrimination continued to flourish, leaving many Japanese people struggling. The U.S. didn't publicly apologize until 1988 and gave each survivor $20,000. Today, we continue to see the same pattern of discrimination against Asians and Asian Americans in the U.S. as a way to put blame on a group of people for a virus that has only worsened in this country.